My family didn't just invite me to lunch. They invited me to be erased. At an upscale restaurant, my mayor's stepfather's daughter covered my name with a champagne glass, called me poor trash, and slapped me in front of 45 witnesses while my own mother turned away. I did not shout. I did not strike back. I made one phone call that lasted 31 seconds. By the time it ended, a $58 million secret had started coming apart, and the seat they denied me at that table was nothing compared to what they were about to lose. I used to think keeping quiet was the price of loving my mother. But that day, I learned silence can protect the people doing harm instead of the person being hurt. The hardest part was not losing my seat at that table. It was realizing I had been giving it up for years. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Then listen closely, because this story starts with one lunch, one covered name card, and one question I should have asked years earlier. How long should a son stay silent just to keep his mother comfortable? 20 minutes after my mother asked me to keep the peace, my stepsister would slap me in front of 45 witnesses. I would not raise a hand back. I would look past her polished smile, past my stepfather's campaign donors, straight toward the security camera, tucked into the corner of that private dining room, and I would say two words that changed everything. Preserve the footage. 31 seconds after the phone call that followed, the first file that would break Mayor Orson Calder's political empire left my phone. But that morning, none of that had happened yet. That morning I was sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee, 3 folders, and a spreadsheet open on my laptop. The apartment was quiet except for the heater clicking in the wall. Outside my window, Braddock Falls looked gray and tired, the way old mill towns do when autumn comes in without asking permission. The folder closest to my elbow was labeled Braddock Senior Housing Renewal Fund. Inside were invoices, payment records, and photographs I had printed, because numbers are easier to ignore when they do not have walls, stairwells, and broken elevators attached to them. My phone lit up. Audra Voss Calder, my mother. I stared at her name longer than I should have. I had learned to distrust invitations from the Calder family. They never came plain. They came wrapped in words like family, support, and just this once. But I had never learned how to ignore my mother's voice. I answered, "Hi, Mom." There was a small pause, the kind she used when she wanted me to hear how tired she was before she asked for anything. "Callan," she said softly, "can you come to lunch today?" I looked at the spreadsheet again. A contractor had billed the city for elevator modernization at Braddock Heights. The photograph beside it showed an out-of-service sign taped to the elevator door. "What lunch?" "At the Meridian Room. It's nothing formal." That was how my mother lied when she wanted to stay gentle. The Meridian Room was where Orson Calder took donors when he wanted them to feel important. It was not where our family went to catch up over soup and coffee. "Mom," I said, "if Orson is there, it's formal. He just wants everyone together." "Everyone?" Another pause. "Venus will be there." Of course she would. Venus Calder was Orson's daughter, 31 years old, always dressed like she had a photographer waiting outside. She had a talent for making cruelty sound like good breeding. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my thumb along the edge of my phone. In my contacts, not far below my mother's name, was another one I had saved months earlier. Hilda Mercer. Ethics. I told myself I would not need that number today. "Callan," my mother said, quieter now. "Just come for one lunch." For me, that was the hook. It had always been the hook. For me, not because it was fair, not because I was wanted, because she needed me to make something easier. I closed the folder and said, "All right, one lunch." By late morning, I had changed into a dark suit and driven across town. The old steel mill district slid past my windows, brick buildings with empty loading bays and faded signs. Farther east, banners promised riverfront luxury apartments and a brighter Braddock Falls. In the distance, Braddock Heights Senior Towers stood against the cloudy sky, 2 tired concrete buildings waiting for repairs that had already been paid for on paper. I looked away before I could talk myself out of lunch. The Meridian Room sat inside a restored bank building downtown. Brass handles, dark wood doors, white tablecloths visible through tall windows. The kind of place where politicians praised working families over meals most working families could not afford. Inside, the air smelled like steak, butter, and expensive flowers. Lowell Keene, the manager, recognized me at the entrance. His smile was polite, but his eyes moved toward the private dining room before he spoke. "Mr. Voss, they're already seated." "Thanks, Lowell." I followed him past framed black and white photographs of old factories, men in work shirts, women outside union halls, real Braddock Falls, preserved on walls for people who no longer had to live it. The private room was already full. Donors, a councilman, Lyle Braddock near the door with his phone in hand, and Orson Calder at the center of it all. My stepfather, the mayor. Silver hair, calm face, voice smooth enough to make a threat sound like public service. My mother sat near him in a cream jacket. She saw me come in. For half a second, her face softened. Then her eyes dropped to her napkin. At the far end of the table, near the service door, I saw a small cream-colored reservation card. Callan Voss. Not Calder. Not family. Just my name, placed where the staff could pass behind my chair. Before I reached it, Venus Calder stepped into my path with a champagne glass in her hand. She looked at the card, smiled, and set the glass directly over my name. "Oh," she said, "they put your name on a card. How generous." A few people nearby went quiet in that careful way people do when they hear something ugly, but do not want to be involved. I did not move the glass. Venus tilted her head. "Don't get comfortable. You were invited for your mother, not because anyone wanted you here." My jaw tightened, but I kept my hands still. I had spent years learning how to read what people tried to hide. Bank records, contract language, false kindness, family silence. That afternoon, Venus Calder hid my name under a champagne glass and smiled like it was nothing. Orson kept talking to the donor beside him. My mother kept looking down. So I sat at the end of the table, near the service door, with my name covered and my phone quiet in my jacket pocket. I told myself it was only lunch. Then I reached for the chair beside my mother, and her hand moved faster than mine. My fingers had barely touched the chair, when a memory came back so clearly, it almost made me lose my place in the room. I was 8 years old again, sitting with my mother at Millie's counter, on a winter afternoon, when the wind came through the diner door every time someone walked in. We had split a grilled cheese, because money was tight, and she had pretended she was not hungry. She had pulled me close in the booth and said, "Sit close, baby, it's cold." That was the mother I had carried with me. Then the Meridian room came back into focus. White tablecloth, silverware lined up like little soldiers, donors murmuring over water glasses, my mother sitting close enough for me to smell her perfume. I began to pull out the chair beside her. Her palm came down over the back of it. Not hard, not dramatic, just quick enough to stop me. "Not that one, honey," she whispered. "Orson needs that seat open." A chair is only a chair until your mother stops you from taking it. I looked at her hand. Her wedding ring caught the warm light from the chandelier. She did not look angry. That would have been easier. She looked nervous, like I had reached for something I should have known was never meant for me. Across the table, Venus watched the whole thing. Orson kept speaking to the man on his right, never once turning his head. That was his gift. He could control a room without appearing to notice anyone he was controlling. I let go of the chair. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded even. I made sure of that. Before I could move back toward the far end, Venus stepped around the table and slid into the chair beside my mother. She placed her designer purse next to the plate, settled her napkin in her lap, and smiled like she had just corrected a seating error. "Even your mother knows where you belong," she said softly. It was not loud enough for the whole room, just loud enough for me. I walked back to the end of the table, near the service door, where the champagne glass still covered my name card. A server moved behind me with a tray and gave me the kind of quick, apologetic glance people give when they witness something they are not allowed to mention. I sat. Orson rose a minute later, tapping a spoon lightly against his glass. "Friends," he said, opening his arms with that practiced warmth. "Thank you for being here. Braddock Falls is changing, and we are going to make sure that change honors the people who built this city." The donors nodded. A councilman lifted his water. Lyle Braddock stood near the wall with his phone low in his hand, watching faces instead of listening. Orson continued, "Our senior housing renewal work is about dignity. It is about safety. It is about keeping promises. In this city, we take care of our own." I kept my eyes on the table. Words like dignity sound different when you have seen the invoices behind them. I did not speak. Not yet. Venus leaned toward my mother and laughed at something no one else had said. Then she glanced down the table at me. "You cleaned up well," she said. "I almost didn't recognize you without that old neighborhood look." A donor near her gave a small, uncomfortable smile and looked away. That was how people like that survived rooms like this. They heard cruelty and called it awkwardness. I reached for my water glass, took one drink, and set it back exactly where it had been. Venus was not finished. "I guess some people spend their whole life trying to prove they belong in places like this," she said. "But you can always tell." My mother's fingers tightened around her napkin. She heard it. That mattered. Venus tilted her head, her smile sharpening. "You don't belong here. Nobody wants poor trash like you around." The room paused, not stopped. People like Orson's donors did not stop for someone else's humiliation. But the sound changed. A fork rested too long against a plate. The server with the water pitcher held still for half a second. Lowell Keene, near the door, looked over. An older woman 2 seats down, Nola Whitcomb, raised her eyes from her coffee. Hollis Vane, the developer, suddenly became fascinated with his salad. Orson's face did not change. I did not look at Venus. I looked at my mother. She was close enough to defend me with one sentence. One ordinary sentence would have done it. "Venus, don't speak to my son that way." That was all. My mother's hand moved to her wedding ring. She turned it once, then again. Under the table, Orson touched her elbow. A small gesture, barely anything. But I saw it, and so did she. Audra inhaled, shifted her eyes toward the tall window, and said nothing. The insult came from Venus. The answer came from my mother's silence. I felt something inside me settle, not break. I had broken over smaller things when I was younger. This was different. This was the quiet sound of an old bargain ending. For most of my life, I had believed silence could be kindness. I thought if I swallowed enough, my mother would suffer less. If I let Venus have the seat, if I let Orson have the room, if I let the Calder name rise while mine stayed under the glass, maybe Audra would finally be safe enough to remember me in public. But sitting there, at the end of that table, I began to understand who my silence had really been protecting. Not my mother, not me, the wrong people. I rested my hand beside my plate and kept my face calm. Every room has a record. Some records are stored on servers. Some are kept by witnesses. Some are written in the exact second a mother turns away from her son. I did not understand that kind of silence all at once. It had taken 20 years for my mother to teach it to me. My mother's silence did not shock me the way it should have. That was the part I hated most. A stranger at that table might have thought I was frozen because Venus had embarrassed me. But I was not frozen. I was remembering. The chandelier light, the wedding ring, the quiet pressure of Orson's hand near my mother's elbow. None of it was new. The room was expensive, but the pattern was old. I was 16 when Audra married Orson Calder. Back then, he was not mayor yet. He was a city councilman with polished shoes, a careful haircut, and a smile that never seemed to rest. He shook hands in grocery store aisles. He remembered people's first names. He could talk about potholes, veterans, church suppers, and property taxes, like each subject personally kept him awake at night. My mother was tired in those days, not weak, tired. She had worked double shifts, worried over utility bills, and raised me as her youngest son with more love than money. So when Orson came along with flowers, dinner reservations, and promises about stability, I wanted to believe in him. I wanted her to sleep through the night without checking the bank balance before bed. After the wedding, she found me outside the reception hall, standing near the soda cooler, while Orson's friends toasted the new Calder family. She touched my cheek and said, "No matter what changes, you're still my boy." I believed her because I needed to. The changes did not arrive all at once. That is how these things work. Nobody announces that you are being moved to the edge. They just ask you to step aside, one small time after another. At Orson's first big campaign picnic, a photographer waved me out of the frame. "Just the family shot," he said. My mother looked sorry. Then she looked at Orson. Then she let the picture happen. At a Christmas dinner 2 years later, Venus slid into the seat beside my mother before I could get there. I was told not to make it awkward. "She's still adjusting," my mother whispered in the kitchen. At a fundraiser downtown, Orson introduced me to a donor as Audra's son from before, then placed his hand on my shoulder like he had been generous enough to include me. Afterward, Mom said, "He didn't mean it that way." That became her favorite sentence. She didn't mean it. Orson has a lot on his plate. Please don't make this harder. In our house, Being the youngest did not mean being protected. It meant everyone assumed I could bend a little further. If Venus said something cruel, I was supposed to be mature. If Orson dismissed me, I was supposed to understand public pressure. If my mother cried, I was supposed to comfort her. Even when I was the one who had been cut open in some quiet way, nobody else could see. So I learned to watch. I watched smiles that ended too quickly. I watched hands touch elbows under tables. I watched people say family when they meant obedience. Later, when I studied accounting and public contracts, that habit became useful. Fraud was not always dramatic. Most of the time, it was a pattern wearing a clean shirt. Repeated vendors, inflated invoices, work orders with no work behind them, non-profit payments that moved too smoothly, signatures on forms for services nobody could find. People hid money the same way families hid pain. They counted on everyone being too polite to ask the next question. That was how I ended up with the Braddock Senior Housing Renewal Fund spread across my kitchen table. The public promise had been simple: repair elevators, replace failing heating systems, fix plumbing, remove mold, make senior buildings safer. But the records did not match the city's speeches. One invoice said an elevator at Braddock Heights had been modernized. A photo taken weeks later showed residents waiting beside an out-of-service sign. Consulting fees appeared under different names but led back to familiar addresses. Venus's nonprofit showed up more often than charity work could explain. A company tied to Bram Calder sat in the vendor map like a fingerprint nobody had bothered to wipe away. At first, I told myself it might be sloppy administration. Then I found the same pattern again and again. That was when I contacted Hilda Mercer at the State Ethics Commission. Hilda was not dramatic. She did not gasp or promise justice by Friday. She asked for documents, dates, and clean copies. She told me evidence needed to survive pressure, politics, and family interference. We built the packet slowly: affidavit drafts, bank transfer summaries, non-profit filings, invoice mismatches, donor meeting timelines. Then my mother found out I had been asking questions. She called me crying. "Callan, please," she said, "please don't make me the mayor's wife who brought down the mayor. Not don't let him steal from seniors. Not tell me what you found. Just don't make me that woman." I had started with records. I ended up staring at the oldest question in my life. How much damage was I supposed to absorb so my mother could keep calling it peace? Back in the Meridian room, Venus was still smiling down the table. Orson was speaking again, smooth as ever, telling donors how Braddock Falls believed in dignity. My mother kept her eyes toward the window, like the city outside had suddenly become fascinating. My phone rested inside my jacket pocket. Hilda Mercer's name was already there. I did not call, not yet. Instead, I looked at the champagne glass covering my name card and understood what the room was asking me to do. Stay quiet, sit where I was placed. Let Venus enjoy the insult. Let my mother avoid the cost. Let Orson keep smiling while the city paid for his lies. I had given them years of silence, but when Venus looked at the glass over my name and smiled, I decided they were owed one warning, and only one. I did not speak right away. That was the mistake Venus kept making about me. She thought silence meant I had nothing to say. Orson thought silence meant he still owned the room. My mother, I think, needed my silence to mean forgiveness. It was none of those things. I sat near the service door with the champagne glass still covering my name. Venus had taken the chair beside my mother. Audra kept her face turned toward the window. Orson stood at the center of the table, lifting his voice just enough to make every donor feel personally included. "Families are the backbone of Braddock Falls," he said. "Seniors deserve safe homes, not empty promises. That is why this renewal work matters." A few people nodded. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. Orson had a gift for saying the word dignity in rooms where no one had to climb 9 flights of stairs because an elevator still had not been repaired. He could make theft sound like service if the lighting was warm enough and the checks on the table were large enough. Venus glanced at me over the rim of her glass. She had expected shame to bend my shoulders. When it did not, irritation moved across her face. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to clean up where they came from," she said. The donor beside her gave a weak smile, then looked at his plate. Venus looked at my suit. But fabric only does so much. My mother lowered her eyes. Orson did not stop speaking, but his rhythm changed by half a beat. That told me he heard her. Lyle Braddock heard it too. He stood near the wall with his phone angled down, pretending to check messages while watching the table. I let my gaze move slowly around the room. Lowell Keene remained near the private entrance, his posture careful. Hollis Vane, the developer, kept cutting at a piece of lettuce that no longer needed cutting. The server with the water pitcher stayed near the sideboard. In the upper corner, a small camera watched the room, with a red light no bigger than a pinhead. They were not waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to become useful to their version of the story. So I gave them nothing rushed, nothing messy. I looked down at the champagne glass. My name was blurred beneath the curve of it, the ink bent by the pale gold liquid. "My name is on the reservation," I said. It was not a complaint. It was a fact. Venus smiled wider, relieved that I had finally answered. Names can be removed. The table changed, not loudly, just enough that you could feel people stop pretending they were only eating lunch. I looked from the glass to Venus. So can lies. Orson stopped talking. Only for a moment, but I saw it. Lyle shifted against the wall. Lowell's eyes moved toward the camera before returning to the room. My mother's hand went to her water glass, though she did not lift it. Venus's smile tightened. "You don't get to threaten this family," she said. "I'm not threatening it." My voice stayed low. That mattered. A loud man is easy to dismiss in a room full of powerful people. A calm one makes them listen harder. I'm giving it one last chance to stop pretending. Venus leaned closer, her perfume sharp over the smell of steak and butter. "You walk in here with your cheap pride and your little files, and you think that makes you equal?" That was when I knew. Maybe she did not understand the whole thing. Maybe Orson had only warned her that I was asking questions. But she knew enough to be afraid of paper. People like Venus never feared feelings. They feared records. I turned my head slightly toward my mother. Audra finally said my name. "Callan?" There it was. Not protection. Not anger at Venus. Not even concern. A warning. My mother did not say my name like a shield. She said it like a leash. For a second, I saw the old kitchen in our first apartment, her tired hands around a coffee mug, her voice asking me to be good, be patient, be understanding. I had been all those things. I had mistaken them for love because she had needed them from me. Orson gave a soft laugh, polished and empty. "Let's not turn lunch into a family courtroom," he said. A few donors chuckled because people often laugh when a powerful man tells them what the mood is supposed to be. I looked at him then. That was his method. Rename the injury, shrink the damage, make the person being hurt look dramatic for noticing. I did not argue. The silence bothered Venus more than any answer could have. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood. It was not a loud sound, but it cut through the room. My mother's fingers closed around her glass. Lowell took one measured step forward. Lyle's thumb hovered near his phone screen. Venus walked around the table with her chin lifted and her smile back in place. But it was not the same smile. The polish had cracked. Underneath it was anger, and under the anger was fear. I stayed seated. The little red light in the corner kept blinking. Venus crossed the small space between us, with the kind of smile people wear when they think no one will ever make them answer for what their hand is about to do. Venus stopped beside my chair, close enough that the room could pretend this was still private. That was the trick with people like her. They learned how to hurt you in public while making everyone else feel rude for noticing. She leaned down a little, her smile bright and thin. "You really think anyone in this room is going to choose you over us?" I stayed seated. My hands were visible. My shoulders were still. I did not rise, did not point, did not give Lyle Braddock a useful photograph. Somewhere above us, the camera kept recording what my body already knew. Venus waited for an answer. I gave her none. That was what broke her. Her hand came fast. The sound cut through the private dining room like a plate cracking on tile. For 1 second, no one moved. A fork slipped from someone's fingers and struck china. Audra's water glass trembled against the table. The server near the sideboard froze with the pitcher in his hand. Lowell Keene stood near the door, his face suddenly drained of all restaurant politeness. Nola Whitcomb, the older woman 2 seats down, lifted both hands to her coffee cup as if steadying herself. Orson did not move. Not right away. That delay told me more than any speech could have. My cheek burned. My ear rang. My right hand closed under the table before I could stop it. For one breath, every careful thing in me went quiet. I was not an analyst then, not a son trying to keep his mother from falling apart, not the man with documents prepared and names saved in his phone. I was just a man sitting in a room full of people who had watched someone put hands on him and then waited to see whether he would make their silence easier. I wanted to stand. I wanted to give them the reaction they had already written the headline for. Then I saw Lyle. His eyes had moved to me, not Venus. His thumb hovered over his phone. Orson's expression sharpened, almost expectant, not worried, ready. By morning, the story would not be mayor's daughter strikes stepson at donor lunch. It would be a strange stepson loses control at private family event. They did not need me to be violent. They only needed me to look dangerous for 3 seconds. My grandmother Iona used to say, "Don't hand angry people the weapon they're begging you to hold." I heard her voice so clearly that my fist loosened. Slowly, finger by finger. Then I looked at my mother. She had not stood. She had not said, "Do not touch my son." She had not even asked if I was all right. Her eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, she turned toward the window again, as if the street outside had called her name. The slap burned my face. My mother's silence went somewhere deeper. That was the final lesson. If I kept waiting for Audra Voss Calder to become my witness, I would grow old at the edge of someone else's table. I lifted my eyes to the corner of the room. The red light was still there. Then I turned toward Lowell. My voice came out steady, which surprised even me. "Preserve the footage." Venus gave a short laugh. "Too quick, too high." "That's it?" she said. "You're asking for a video?" I did not look at her. There was nothing left to win from Venus Calder in conversation. She still thought humiliation was the event. She did not understand that documentation was the answer. Lowell looked from my face to the camera, then toward Orson. A memory seemed to pass behind his eyes. I had heard stories about a young server Venus had embarrassed the year before, and how City Hall pressure had turned that girl's complaint into a scheduling issue. Lowell knew the cost of hearing me. He also knew the cost of pretending he had not. For a moment, he was only a man standing between a mayor's table and a locked camera room. Then he nodded once. "Yes, sir." He did not raise his voice. He did not make a speech. He simply turned toward the service hallway and moved with purpose. For the first time that afternoon, someone in that room had heard me. Orson stood then. Of course he did. He adjusted his jacket and used the warm, grave tone he saved for prayer breakfasts and storm briefings. "Everyone," he said, "let's take a breath. This is a painful family moment. A painful family moment." That was how fast he tried to rename it. Not assault, not public humiliation, not his daughter striking a seated man in front of witnesses. Family. The word had covered a lot of damage in my life. Audra looked down at her lap. Venus folded her arms, still pleased with herself, though her eyes kept flicking toward the door where Lowell had gone. Lyle stepped closer to Orson, already preparing the shape of tomorrow's statement. I remained in my chair. My cheek still burned. My name still sat under the champagne glass. My mother still said nothing, but something had changed. I was no longer enduring the room. I was building the record. My hand moved inside my jacket and closed around my phone. When the screen lit against my palm, the name waiting there belonged to the one person Orson Calder could not charm, threaten, or rename. The screen lit against my palm beneath the edge of the table. Hilda Mercer, Ethics. That contact had not appeared in my phone by accident. It had been sitting there for months, quiet as a sealed envelope, waiting for the day I stopped protecting people who had never protected me. Around me, the room had broken into whispers. Venus was still standing too close. Orson was already rebuilding the afternoon with softer words. My mother looked smaller than she had 10 minutes earlier, but not frightened for me, frightened for the life she had chosen. I knew what the call would cost. If I made it, Audra might say I destroyed her marriage. If I did not, Venus's slap would become another family misunderstanding. If I made it, the senior housing files would leave my hands. If I did not, people like Ruth Ann Bell would keep waiting on broken elevators while Orson gave speeches about dignity. I pressed the call button. Venus noticed and let out a little laugh. "You calling your lawyer now?" I did not answer. Hilda picked up on the second ring. "Mercer, this is Callan Voss," I said. "Meridian Room. 45 witnesses. Mayor Calder is present. Release the packet and move on the preservation order." There was no gasp, no wasted question. That was why I trusted her. "Are you confirming activation?" she asked. I looked at my mother. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Then I looked at Orson, whose expression had gone still, in a way that made the room feel colder. "Yes," I said. "I'm done waiting." The call ended at 31 seconds. Venus stared at me. "I'm done waiting?" she repeated. "What is that supposed to mean?" This time, my silence did not belong to fear. It belonged to the record. Near the service hallway, Lowell Keene moved fast, without looking like he was rushing. I saw him speak to a young assistant by the swinging door. "Lock the camera room," he said. "If anyone asks, tell them I ordered it." The assistant hesitated. Lowell's jaw tightened. "Now please." Then he took out his own phone. He was not fearless. I could see that. A restaurant like the Meridian Room survived on permits, inspections, liquor approvals, and city goodwill. Orson Calder could make a man's business suffer without ever raising his voice. But Lowell had made his choice. He stepped farther into the hallway and said into the phone, "This is Lowell Keene at the Meridian Room. I need to report an assault in our private dining area. We have video, and I want it preserved properly." Orson heard enough. His eyes moved toward Lowell, then to Lyle Braddock. "Everyone," Orson said, lifting both hands. "Let's not turn a painful family misunderstanding into a public spectacle." Family misunderstanding. He had already tried family moment. Now he was trimming the words even smaller. Lyle moved toward the private room door. I knew that motion. Close the door, lower the sound, put the problem where Orson could name it before anyone else did. "Leave it open," I said. Lyle stopped with one hand on the brass handle. Orson turned to me with a warning smile. "Callan, this is family." "The slap was family," I said. "The $58 million is federal." The room changed so completely it felt like the air had been pulled through a vent. Hollis Vane stopped looking at his plate. A donor at the far side set down his glass. Lyle did not move. Venus's face lost its polished certainty. My mother whispered, "Callan, please." For 20 years, please had meant my pain could wait. That afternoon, it finally stopped working. Orson stepped closer to the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know which invoices were paid," I said. "I know which work was never done. I know which consulting vendors share addresses. And I know who signed the outreach filings." I did not look at Venus for long. I did not need to. Her hand went to the back of the chair she had stolen from me. I kept my voice even. Money meant for elevators, heating systems, mold removal, plumbing, and fire safety did not stay where the city told people it went. One of the donors muttered, "Is this true?" Orson answered him, "Not me. This is a disgruntled family member trying to embarrass us." There it was again. Us. As if the people in senior towers were outside the circle. As if truth became dirty when it came from the son they kept at the end of the table. From the hallway came the faint sound of a lock turning. Lowell had secured the camera room. A moment later, through the tall windows, I saw a dark official sedan pull to the curb across the street. Not dramatic, no sirens, no rush. Just a quiet car arriving exactly when a prepared process begins to move. The private dining room door remained open. The champagne glass still covered my name, but no one was laughing at it now. Outside, downtown Braddock Falls kept moving like nothing had changed. Inside that room, every person who had smiled at my humiliation was about to learn where the money had gone. No one argued with me right away. That was how I knew the figure had landed. $58 million was not an insult Venus could laugh off. It was not a family disagreement Orson could smooth over with a soft voice. That kind of money carried paperwork, subpoenas, signatures, bank records, and questions people in expensive suits did not want asked in public. Orson's face stayed composed, but his eyes changed. He was no longer looking at me like a stepson who had embarrassed him. He was looking at me like a file he had failed to shred. Venus stood beside my chair, still trying to understand how the room had slipped away from her. To her, the slap had been the whole event. She had wanted me humiliated, angry, small. She had not expected elevators, invoices, and federal funds to walk in behind it. My mother knew better. Audra looked terrified because she knew I did not say numbers in public unless I could prove them. "The Braddock Senior Housing Renewal Fund," I said, keeping my voice level, "was sold to this city as a promise. Working elevators, safe heat, plumbing repairs, mold removal, fire systems, accessible entrances. Basic things older people should not have to beg for. A donor near the end of the table shifted in his seat. I went on. But the money did not stay with those repairs. It moved through consulting contracts tied to Bram Calder. It moved through inflated invoices. It moved through community outreach payments and vendor names that changed just enough to look separate. I let my eyes pass over Venus, and it moved through a nonprofit that had no business touching that much public money. Her lips parted. She did not speak. I thought of Ruth Ann Bell, 78 years old, standing on the 9th floor of Braddock Heights, with both hands on her walker. Her building had an elevator modernization invoice marked paid. In real life, she had missed 2 medical appointments because that elevator still quit between floors. $58 million sounds distant until you picture a woman with bad knees staring at a broken elevator the city already claimed it fixed. Orson stepped closer. "You are making accusations you cannot possibly understand." There it was, the old move. Make me emotional, make me unqualified, make me sound like a bitter son with a grudge. "I understand paid invoices," I said. "I understand unfinished work. I understand signatures on filings. And I understand why you wanted that door closed." Audra stood then. Not when Venus struck me, not when I sat there with my face burning. She stood when Orson's name was in danger. She reached for my sleeve. Her hand trembled. "Please, Callan," she whispered. "Not here. Don't ruin everything." I looked down at her fingers on my jacket. That same hand had stopped me from taking the chair beside her. That same hand had turned a wedding ring while Venus called me poor trash. I gently removed her hand. "I did let it go," I said, "for 20 years. And when she hit me, I looked for you. You turned away." Audra's face folded, but she had no answer that could survive the truth. The next hour did not look like a movie. No one stormed the room. No one shouted into cameras. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for Orson. Officer Arlen Pike arrived and took the report. He asked plain questions. Who struck whom? Was there video? Were there witnesses? Lowell confirmed the camera room was locked. Sela Moritz, the restaurant owner, came in pale but steady and said the footage would be preserved for police and investigators. Orson kept saying, "Let's handle this responsibly." I noticed he never said honestly. By the next morning, his campaign had found its language. I was back in my apartment with a dull ache in my cheek and my kitchen table covered in folders when my phone started filling with alerts. The first statement came from Lyle Braddock. Mayor Calder's family was saddened by yesterday's private incident involving an estranged stepson with a long history of resentment toward the Calder family. A local outlet picked it up within the hour. Mayor Calder's phoner says estranged stepson weaponized family tension at donor lunch. There it was, estranged. Not struck, not witness, not whistleblower, estranged. They were doing what they always did. First they hurt you, then they named your reaction. For a few minutes I sat very still. The old habit came back like a hand on the back of my neck. Stay quiet. Let it pass. Do not make your mother cry. Do not give them more to use. But this time, there was footage. By late afternoon, Ellis Rohn, a reporter who still believed local news meant something, published a careful story. The video had been provided through the police report and confirmed by the restaurant's preservation log. It showed me seated. It showed Venus approaching. It showed the slap. It showed me not raising my voice. And it showed my mother turning away. Nola Whitcomb gave one sentence to the reporter. He never raised his voice. She did. That sentence did more damage than a speech would have. The word estranged began to sour in people's mouths. That evening, while Orson's statement was still being shared by people who had not seen the footage yet, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voice was older, careful, shaken, but not confused. "Mr. Voss, this is Verna Cabrales. They called me confused when I asked about those invoices. Now they're calling you unstable. I think we need to talk before they bury this too." I replayed it once. Then again. Verna Cabrales did not sound like a confused woman on that voicemail. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for one honest witness to survive long enough to call back. I called Verna Cabrales back before I had time to talk myself out of it. We met 2 days later in a study room at the public library, the one near Braddock Heights where seniors came in to use the computers and read the newspaper for free. Verna arrived early. She was 67, neatly dressed, with a canvas tote pressed against her side and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a cord. She did not look confused. She looked like a woman who had been dismissed so many times she had learned to carry proof instead of anger. "I was assigned reconciliation on the senior housing fund," she said after we sat down. I asked why elevator invoices were marked complete before the work was done. "What did they say?" She gave a small, humorless smile. "That I didn't understand the new system. Then difficult. Then too old to keep up." She opened the tote and placed a folder, a flash drive, and handwritten notes on the table. "They called me confused," she said. "They called you unstable. That's how they bury people like us." That line stayed with me because it was not polished. It was tired truth. If an older woman questioned invoices, she was confused. If a stepson exposed fraud, he was bitter. If a server complained, she was dramatic. If a tenant spoke up, she was ungrateful. Verna tapped the flash drive. I kept a backup recording from a finance subcommittee meeting. I was assigned to prepare minutes. They forgot that part when they pushed me out. What's on it? Orson talking about moving outreach funds through the nonprofit and consulting channels before campaign season. I stared at the small drive in her hand. It looked like nothing, a bit of plastic and metal, but it carried the sound of a city being sold in pieces. The next week moved carefully, not quickly. Hilda Mercer did not let anger set the pace. She reviewed Verna's recording, matched it to meeting notes, checked timestamps, and added it to the sequence with the affidavit, bank transfers, nonprofit filings, invoice mismatches, police report, witness statements, and restaurant footage. "Procedure is not the enemy," Hilda told me. "It is how truth survives powerful people." I remembered that when we walked into the hearing room at City Hall. The room smelled like old wood, coffee, and camera equipment. Reporters lined the back wall. Council members sat behind microphones that had probably been there since the 70s. Seniors from Braddock Heights filled 2 rows near the aisle. Verna sat quietly among them. Audra sat behind Orson. Venus wore a navy dress and pearls, like clothing could testify on her behalf. Lyle Braddock had a folder in front of him and the expression of a man who still believed presentation could beat evidence. I sat beside Hilda where I could see the screen and my mother. I did not feel victorious. I felt exposed. Orson spoke first through counsel, then leaned into the microphone himself. His voice was lower than usual, wounded in just the right places. "My family has been attacked by a bitter young man who never accepted love when it was offered." Audra looked at the table. Then Lyle produced the memo. It suggested I had stood to benefit from a follow-up audit if Orson's administration was damaged. That was the dangerous part. It was not fully invented. My old firm had discussed possible audit work months before. Orson had simply cut away the part where I refused compensation, referral fees, and contract participation. Reporters began typing. Venus almost smiled. Then I saw my mother look at me as if she did not know what to believe. That nearly did what Venus's slap could not. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to explain every date, every email, every line they had clipped. But Orson had chosen the battlefield. If I reacted like a hurt son, he would turn the hearing into a family argument again. So I leaned toward Hilda. "Start with the footage," I said. Her eyes moved to mine. Then she nodded. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen showed the Meridian room, not the slap first, earlier. My hand reaching for the chair beside my mother. Audra's palm stopping me. Venus placing the champagne glass over my name card. Venus saying I did not belong. Venus calling me poor trash. Then the slap. Then me, seated, hands visible, voice calm. "Preserve the footage." And then my mother turning away. The hearing room did not murmur. It went still. People had expected violence. Instead, they saw the small betrayal before the loud one. Hilda let the silence work before she spoke. "The mayor's exhibit is incomplete." She displayed the full email chain. "My refusal of compensation. My refusal of referral fees. My written recusal from any contract connected to the packet." I leaned toward the microphone only once. I gave up the contract before I made the call. That was all I needed to say. Next came the glossy brochure from Calder Youth and Senior Outreach. Venus's smiling photograph. Seniors posed beside ribbon-cutting banners. Then Hilda placed beside it the IRS filings, bank summaries, and invoice charts. I looked at Venus. "You signed the forms." Her face had gone pale. "My father told me they were ceremonial." Hilda did not raise her voice. Ceremonial signatures do not move public funds. Finally, she played Verna's audio. Orson's voice filled the room, not campaign warm now, but private and practical. Route the outreach through the foundation. Keep the vendor names separate. We don't need a senior tower audit before November. No one moved. No family story could cover that. No memo could soften it. No polished statement could rename what everyone had just heard. Orson tried to speak, but the council chair cut in. Mayor Calder, sit down. Audra stared at the blank screen after the footage ended. I think she was still seeing her own hand on that chair. Venus would not look at me. Lyle closed his folder. I did not feel healed, but for the first time, the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. When the hearing room emptied, Orson Calder still had one performance left, and this time, he wanted me alone in the house where my picture had never hung. The week after the hearing did not feel like victory. It felt like paperwork. The state party distanced itself from Orson Calder by Monday afternoon. By Tuesday, 2 major donors froze their support. The city council requested an expanded review of every senior housing contract tied to the renewal fund. Hilda's office continued its investigation, and the U.S. Attorney's Public Corruption Unit confirmed it had opened a review. Venus was cited in the assault case, and her nonprofit records were subpoenaed. Her board announced she was stepping aside while filings were examined. Lowell Keene and Sella Moritz took pressure from people who had once begged for tables at the Meridian Room, but after Ellis Rohn published the preservation timeline, the public backed them. The footage had not been leaked for entertainment. It had been protected because powerful people were already trying to rename what happened. At Braddock Heights, residents watched hearing clips in the community room. Ruth Ann Bell told a reporter, "I never wanted pity. I wanted the elevator they said they fixed." That line traveled farther than Orson's speeches ever had. Verna Cabrales was no longer called confused. Her old emails, ignored for months, became part of the official record. Justice, I learned, is not always a door slamming shut. Sometimes it is a phone call, a resignation letter, a corrected headline, and people who used to look away suddenly saying they had been concerned all along. My mother called 6 times. I did not answer the first 5. That may sound cold, but in my family, picking up my mother's call had always meant stepping back into the role she needed me to play. The good son, the quiet son, the one who understood. On the 6th voicemail, she was crying. "Callan, I need to talk to you. I didn't know all of it. I was scared. Please, baby, please." I still knew the sound of my mother crying. I just no longer believed every tear was a reason for me to disappear. Later that day, she sent a text. "Orson wants to apologize as a family. Please come to the house." As a family. That phrase told me enough. Still, I went. Not because I trusted him. Not because I was ready to forgive. I went because some doors have to be closed while you are standing upright, looking the person in the eye. The Calder house sat on the west side of town, above the old mill neighborhoods, with trimmed hedges and a flag on the porch. From the street, it still looked respectable. That was Orson's favorite kind of lie. Audra opened the door. Her face looked thinner. She reached for me, stopped herself, and stepped aside. In the living room, the campaign photograph still hung over the mantel. Orson, Audra, and Venus. A family that serves. I was not in it. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a picture they had already framed without me. Audra saw me looking. "Callan?" Then she stopped. Maybe she finally understood there was no soft way to explain an empty space. Orson entered without his campaign pin. He looked older, but age is not the same thing as remorse. He lowered his head. "I'm asking for forgiveness," he said. "For your mother's sake." There it was, the old key and the old lock. For your mother. He knew that phrase had opened me for 20 years. I said nothing. Then I saw the document on the coffee table. A prepared statement. It said the family dispute had become emotional. It said I did not believe Audra had knowingly participated. It said I hoped the investigation would not destroy a lifetime of service. At the bottom was a signature line. Callan Voss, my name. Venus had hidden it under a champagne glass. Hilda had read it into the public record. Now Orson wanted to use it to polish his damage. I pushed the paper back across the table. "You don't get to use my name to clean up yours." Orson's face tightened. "This is for your mother. This family has suffered enough. You're not asking for forgiveness, I said. You're asking for damage control. For once, he had no clean line ready. Audra began to cry. I'm sorry. I should have stood up. I should have said something. I was afraid. I believed that she was afraid. I also believed fear did not erase what she chose. I don't hate you, I told her, but I can't keep losing myself so you don't have to face what you chose. She covered her mouth, and I could see the mother from Millie's counter somewhere behind the mayor's wife. I loved that woman. Maybe I always would, but love was no longer permission to disappear. I left before Orson could perform grief into another request. Evening had settled over Braddock Falls when I drove back through town. I passed the old factory streets, the senior towers, the restaurant district, and finally pulled into the lot outside Millie's counter. The booth near the window was still there. I stood beside it for a moment and remembered my mother's voice from a lifetime ago. Sit close, baby. It's cold. Then I sat down. No one made room for me. No one chose me. No one had to. Power had not made Orson Calder larger. It had only made his choices louder. The investigation was not finished. The residence still needed repairs. My mother's apology was not complete, and my heart was not magically healed. But I was done waiting for the Calder family to decide whether I belonged. By the time the coffee cooled in front of me, I finally understood that a man can lose his seat at the table and still keep his name.